Inside a packed cultural summit in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts Kanye West live on stage over his explosive claims of ancestral identity and divine inheritance. He fights to defend his legacy with passion and star power. But just minutes later, Jasmine calmly unveils three government-sealed DNA reports that shatter his narrative and paralyze the crowd. The room turns to stone. Kanye grips the mic with trembling hands. The myth collapses, and when the world sees the proof, do they still believe in the man, or only the myth he sold them? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the stone vaults of the United States Capitol, something unusual was happening. This wasn't just another budget hearing or political grandstanding session. This was a special inquiry called by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett herself on one explosive theme: how religion and ancestral identity were being used to shape public policy, sway cultural opinion, and silence critics. At the center of the controversy stood one man who needed no introduction: Kanye West. Rapper, billionaire, cultural force, and now self-proclaimed real Hebrew and descendant of the original Israelites. His recent statements about race, the Holocaust, and Jewish identity had sparked outrage worldwide. But instead of hiding, Kanye had stepped forward with a bold offer. He would come to Congress and prove everything, with his words, with his history, and with his DNA. The hearing room was packed, not just with politicians and staffers, but with journalists, religious scholars, human rights advocates, and young people from across the country. Everyone knew this was bigger than politics. This was about truth, or lies, written into blood. Kanye entered the chamber alone, wearing a long black coat, combat boots, and a simple silver chain. He walked with calm, but his presence hit like thunder. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He moved like a man on a mission, not to defend, but to declare. Behind him, the tension crackled. Was this man a prophet of truth or a master of manipulation? No one could say. But one thing was certain: he had come to prove he was chosen. And Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't here to debate theology. She was here to test evidence. And she had something no belief system could erase: a sealed envelope. Kanye West was already seated when the silence settled across the room like a heavy curtain. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But no one could ignore him. Dressed in a black coat that fell past his knees and a thick silver cross hanging low around his neck, he didn't look like a witness at a congressional hearing. He looked like someone who believed deeply that he was standing in for something greater than himself: a prophet, not a defendant; a vessel, not a celebrity. The polished table in front of him looked more like an altar than a place for testimony. His hands rested calmly on either side of the microphone, fingers still, eyes steady. He was quiet, but there was tension in the stillness, as if he were waiting for the exact moment to speak words he had already rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and controlled, but full of weight. "I'm not here to defend myself," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. "I'm not here to fight or argue or apologize. I'm here to confirm something that lives inside me, something passed down through blood, not documents, not politics, but memory. I'm here to confirm a prophecy, not one I invented, but one I inherited." His words hung in the air like smoke, slow, thick, impossible to ignore. Some people shifted in their chairs. Others leaned in. It didn't matter what they believed. In that moment, Kanye believed enough for everyone. Jasmine Crockett listened without interrupting. She didn't write anything down. She didn't raise an eyebrow. She just sat there, composed, still, and completely focused. When he finished speaking, the silence stretched for a few seconds more. Then she leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but exact, and said, "Then let's allow science to confirm it with you." Nothing in her voice was mocking, but nothing in it offered comfort either. It was the sound of a door closing, and once closed, whatever came next would be hard to escape. The silence after Jasmine's statement lingered, but it wasn't empty. It was electric, heavy, charged like the stillness before a thunderstorm breaks. And in that pause, Kanye West leaned slightly forward, as if answering a call only he could hear. He rested both hands flat on the polished wood before him. His voice, when it came, didn't shout. It didn't demand. It simply arrived, measured, grounded, with the quiet certainty of someone who believed every word was sacred. "You want to measure my blood?" he said slowly, his eyes not fixed on anyone in particular, but somehow touching everyone. "Fine, but before you test what's in my body, you need to understand what's been in my soul my whole life." His tone was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "I've carried something that most people don't see. Some try to name it arrogance. Others call it madness. But it's neither. It's memory. Not mine. Ours." He tapped his chest. "The memory of a people displaced, discredited, and told their history began with bondage. I refuse that lie." He paused, letting the stillness deepen before continuing. "I've studied the scriptures, not like a scholar, but like a man searching for his own name, and I found it." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "In the book of Deuteronomy, in Jeremiah, in the exile, in the lamentation, in the promise. I saw my people not as victims, but as survivors of silence." His voice didn't rise, but it filled the room. "I am not a mistake of history. I am part of a truth that was buried on purpose." He sat up straighter, his voice tightening, not in fear, but focus. "What flows through my veins is not just African. It's not just American. It's something older. It's ancestral, prophetic. It's the same blood that heard the voice of God in the wilderness. The same blood that was hunted, scattered, renamed, and still refused to die." He glanced at the Bible on the table beside him, fingers resting lightly on its cracked spine. "And that's why I speak the way I do. That's why I create the way I do. Because my vision doesn't come from ego. It comes from inheritance." There was no sound from the gallery, not even the click of a pen. It was the kind of silence reserved for moments when something dangerous and beautiful is unfolding. Kanye didn't flinch. He continued, slower now, each word deliberate. "I'm not just a musician. I'm not just a businessman. I'm not even just a black man in America. I'm a living echo of names erased, of truths denied, of dignity stolen. And if my presence disturbs people, it's because I remind them of what they tried to forget." He nodded once, as if to himself. "I'm not asking for acceptance. I'm reclaiming what was never theirs to take." The air in the chamber tightened, like the space between two notes in a song that hasn't resolved. And yet no one moved. No one interrupted. Because whether or not they believed his words, there was no denying the force with which they were delivered. Kanye wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was telling them, "I know who I am, even if you never did." The weight of Kanye's final words still hung in the air, like the echo of a bell struck deep inside the room. But Jasmine Crockett didn't react with rebuttal or applause. She didn't engage in debate. She didn't meet passion with more passion. Instead, she moved with the kind of quiet precision that speaks louder than confrontation. Her hand slid toward a thick, sealed envelope resting just beside her notes. She picked it up, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but with the care of someone who understood the gravity of what it contained. It wasn't just a document. It was evidence. It was clarity. And in the right hands, it could also be reckoning. She placed the envelope on the table between them with exactness, letting it settle like a gavel before a verdict. The room, already still, seemed to draw in tighter. No one moved. The rustle of clothing, the clack of pens, all vanished. This wasn't silence born of boredom. It was tension, pure and undiluted, the kind that gathers right before something irreversible happens. Then she looked at him, not with judgment, but with unwavering focus, and asked a question that struck with more force than raised voices ever could. "Mr. West, do you believe in science?" Her tone was level, almost gentle, but there was steel behind it, sharpened over years of watching people twist truth into convenience. The question didn't accuse. It didn't provoke. It offered him a choice. Kanye didn't speak right away. He looked at the envelope, then at her. His expression didn't shift, but behind his eyes there was a flicker of something deeper, a calculation, a moment of stillness, not hesitation, but recognition of the moment's weight. He knew this wasn't rhetoric anymore. This was a line drawn in the marble beneath their feet. Jasmine's voice came again, just as steady. If the contents of this envelope contradict what you've said today, if they challenge the heritage you've claimed, will you acknowledge it? Publicly? The question didn't come with force. It came with clarity. With the precision of someone who knew that true accountability wasn't loud. It was quiet, inescapable, and undeniable. The room didn't shift. It clenched. Kanye leaned forward slightly, resting both hands on the table. His fingers pressed lightly against the surface, the muscles in his jaw tightening for just a second. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, clearer than it had been all day. "If it's the truth," he said, "then it's not my enemy." He nodded once, slowly. "I came here because I believed I had truth in me. If what's in that envelope says otherwise, then I'll face it." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, he wasn't Kanye West the icon, or the controversy, or the headline. He was a man, confronted not by an opponent, but by truth itself. And across from him, Jasmine Crockett said nothing more. Because for now, the envelope would speak next. There was no applause. No one moved. The air between Jasmine and Kanye stayed tight, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. She let the silence breathe for a moment longer, then calmly reached for a deep red folder beside her. She opened it slowly, carefully, as if handling something powerful. "Let's take a closer look at what kind of truth has been funded," she said, her voice cool, steady. She pulled out a thick document covered in numbers, names, and bank stamps. It had the seal of the U.S. Treasury printed at the top. "These are official financial records," she said. "We got them through a subpoena. They show that a private company linked to the Yeezy Foundation sent money to 3 genetic research labs between 2021 and 2024. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. None of these payments were public. They were hidden. No press releases, no public announcements, just quiet transfers behind fake company names and anonymous accounts. Behind her, a screen lit up. Everyone could now see the evidence. $420,000 wired to a lab in Atlanta. $775,000 to a research center in Tel Aviv. Another $1.1 million sent to a company in the Cayman Islands known for DNA research for rich clients. Jasmine flipped to another page. Each transfer was labeled something vague, like donation or consulting, she said. But inside emails from Yeezy's own team, we found what they really called it, heritage alignment research. Then she looked up at Kanye, her eyes sharp, her tone even sharper. "Tell me, Mr. West, what exactly were you trying to align?" Kanye didn't say a word. He didn't flinch, but the calm on his face looked harder to hold. The room remained frozen. This wasn't drama. It was pressure. Jasmine had just placed the truth on the table, plain and clear. And Kanye, the man who just said he wasn't afraid of truth, was staring right at it. Jasmine wasn't yelling. She wasn't attacking. She was just uncovering the facts, one careful step at a time. And now everyone saw them. The truth didn't have to shout. It only had to be uncovered. The numbers alone had rattled the room, but Jasmine wasn't finished. The financial trail had told one story, but the documents that followed were about to tell another. She reached back into the red folder and withdrew a slim, stapled contract, slightly creased at the edges. She held it up just long enough for the cameras to focus, then placed it flat on the table, turning the front page to face Kanye. "This," she said, her voice lower now, more focused, "is a private service agreement between a Georgia-based DNA analysis lab and an entity registered under one of Yeezy Foundation's shell subsidiaries." Her finger tapped the page gently, right above the bold heading, Contract Number 1172-C, Lineage Interpretation Protocol. She looked out toward the committee. This contract isn't about health testing. It's not about family history. It's not even about standard ancestry reporting. This was a custom agreement with very specific instructions. She paused, letting the weight build before reading aloud. Clause 2B requests that the lab clarify and emphasize any indicators of Israelite African heritage. Clause 4C goes further, asking researchers to optimize the representation of Hebrew genetic markers within report summaries provided to the client. The words hit the room like a dropped match in dry grass. There was no need for interpretation. This wasn't about science. This was narrative engineering. This wasn't a request for facts, Jasmine continued. It was a request for confirmation, for enhancement, for something more aligned with belief than with biology. She turned to Kanye again, eyes sharp but steady. This wasn't about finding the truth. This was about designing it. Kanye sat motionless, but the strain in his jaw was visible now, tight, clenched. The lights felt hotter, the envelope on the table heavier. The crowd behind him didn't shift, but the atmosphere had changed. Jasmine hadn't exposed a secret. She had exposed intent. Not just to fund research, but to shape it, to turn science into strategy. And now the question wasn't just what he believed. It was what he'd been willing to manipulate to make it real. The weight of the contract still lingered in the air, like a held breath, when Jasmine calmly placed one final document on the table. It looked unassuming. Just a single printed email, slightly crumpled at the edges from being handled carefully. Maybe too carefully. But what it contained, what it revealed, was far more damning than the contractual language before it. There was no need to raise her voice. Jasmine knew that sometimes the most devastating truths arrive not with thunder, but with stillness. I want to direct the committee's attention to this internal communication, she began, tapping the page softly with her index finger. Dated just 2 weeks after the lab in Georgia sent their preliminary results to Mr. West's team. Her voice held no anger, no triumph, just quiet, unforgiving certainty. It's from a senior assistant, his longtime aide, and it reads. She paused, then leaned slightly forward, allowing the words to roll out slowly, clearly. The results do not match the public claims ye has made. We'll need another run. Quietly, please filter again. Focus on ancestral patterns that can support the Israelite narrative. Presentation matters. There was no gasping in the room, no murmurs, just that awful, oppressive stillness that only shows up when denial meets evidence head-on. Jasmine's eyes remained locked on the page, but her voice sharpened. This wasn't a conversation about errors. This wasn't scientific skepticism. This was strategic, tactical, a deliberate attempt to bend truth until it snapped into alignment with image. She looked up now, slowly, as if scanning not just the room but the entire country watching. When truth becomes inconvenient and you try to rewrite it, that's not a misunderstanding. That's manipulation. Her hand trembled faintly as she set the email down, palm lingering on the paper like she was grounding herself against the weight of it all. But her voice didn't falter. This was never about heritage. It was about power, about branding belief as fact, and hoping no one would check the receipts. Then one beat of silence, and another. Even Kanye, who had always commanded attention, now seemed frozen, reduced not by force, but by the quiet erosion of credibility. And that was the real shift in the room. Not that people disagreed with him, but that, for the first time, they doubted him. The room had stopped breathing. After the reading of the internal email, after the document bearing his signature was gently slid across the polished desk, there was only the faint hum of the ceiling lights and the invisible tension that pulled every shoulder tight. The silence wasn't neutral, it was charged, not with hatred, but with expectation. Everyone was waiting to see how Kanye West, artist, mogul, self-proclaimed prophet, would respond now that the paper trail had caught up to his proclamations. Kanye's jaw clenched first, his fingers curled slightly, knuckles pale against the table. His eyes, which had once roamed freely over the room like he owned the air inside it, now locked squarely on Jasmine Crockett. And when he finally spoke, the words didn't come out confused. They came out accusatory, like someone being robbed of something intangible. "So what is it you're trying to say?" he snapped, each syllable striking like flint. "You think I bought this? That I went out and purchased my own history?" He leaned forward, almost daring her to flinch. "You saying I'm some kind of, what, manufactured product? A lie dressed up in a crucifix and legacy?" His voice rose with every question, like each one was a blow thrown into the void, looking for something solid to hit. "Is that it? You want to humiliate me in front of the whole damn country by saying my identity's fake?" His hand hovered over the document, but didn't touch it. Around him, the room shifted. Some leaned back, some leaned forward, but all held their breath. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about the tone, the thunder in his voice, the tremor in the ground beneath his words. Jasmine, by contrast, didn't move. Not a flicker of emotion passed over her face. No trace of anger or victory or even satisfaction. Only stillness, like water that refused to ripple. When she finally spoke, her tone was almost too calm, as if that was the sharpest blade of all. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Mr. West," she said, not raising her voice even a fraction. "And I'm not here to define your identity. That's not my place." She paused, letting the words sink in like stones dropped into deep water. "But what I am doing is showing you exactly what you approved, what you funded, what your team requested in writing." She gently tapped the paper again. "That signature isn't mine. That lab wasn't chosen by me. And the phrase, 'optimize Hebrew markers for public release,' that came from someone representing you." Kanye stared at her, but this time there was hesitation in his glare, a shadow of something that hadn't been there before. Doubt, not in her, but in the room, in the framing, in how this all looked now that it wasn't abstract anymore. Now that it was printed in black and white. Jasmine continued steady as ever. "I don't need to accuse you of anything, Mr. West, because the facts already speak, loud enough that I don't have to." For the first time, Kanye sat back slightly, not collapsing, not conceding, but processing. And that's when the emotional blow truly landed. Not in her words, but in the absence of drama. She hadn't mocked him. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't twisted the knife. She just opened a door and made the whole nation look inside with her. And just when it seemed the weight of silence might swallow the room whole, Jasmine moved again, slow, deliberate, not to retaliate, but to reveal. From the folds of her leather binder, Jasmine withdrew 3 sealed documents, each one thick, stamped, and bordered with the unmistakable red and gold crest of a federal agency. She laid them out in front of her like cards at the end of a game. The first bore the insignia of the National Genomics Council, the second from the Department of Forensic Integrity, the third marked confidential by the U.S. Office of Scientific Oversight. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her voice didn't waver. "These," she said, letting her words cut through the tension like a wire through ice, "are from 3 independent laboratories. None were contacted by my office. None knew each other's findings. And all 3, without communication or collaboration, reached the exact same conclusion." She paused, 1 beat, 2, then added, "And each bears a federal seal, which means tampering isn't just unlikely, it's a felony." The sound of her words didn't echo, but the impact was thunderous. Kanye sat motionless, his mouth slightly open, but no sound came. The audience, once captivated by his rhythm and rhetoric, was now motionless too, caught between admiration and unease. Jasmine tapped the folder closest to her. "This lab's findings are dated 4 months before your most recent album release," she noted calmly, "which means the results were known before you made certain public claims." Her hand moved to the second. "This one was commissioned by a member of your own production team, under a different name, but with matching DNA codes." And finally, the third. "And this one was quietly filed with the Department of Archives, buried under an unrelated health grant." She looked up. "But nothing stays buried forever." She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was surgical, precise, professional, and unshakably armed with truth. And for the first time that day, the crowd didn't just see a confrontation. They saw a reckoning. Not of faith or culture or ego, but of evidence. And Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman in this room. She was the mirror no one wanted to look into. The courtroom, once electric with performance, now settled into something colder, more dangerous. This wasn't spectacle anymore. This was the edge of justice. There was no more theater, no more deflection, no more thunder from the pulpit. Only paper. Only fact. Only the final moment Jasmine had prepared for. Jasmine placed the sealed document flat on the table, her fingers pausing briefly over the government crest embossed in silver on the envelope. She looked up, not at Kanye, but at the entire chamber. A silent jury of lawmakers, staffers, journalists, and citizens who had come expecting controversy, but now faced something far heavier: reality. She opened the envelope with clinical precision. No dramatics, no fanfare, just the clean sound of truth about to be told. Her voice came low but unwavering, like the quiet before an avalanche. Genetic analysis report conducted independently by 3 federally certified labs using full-spectrum genomic tracing and region-specific chromosomal markers. She allowed the silence to hang a little longer, not for effect, but to let the room brace. Subject: Kanye Omari West, 79% West African ancestry, primarily Nigerian and Ghanaian gene clusters. A ripple moved across the room. Someone exhaled sharply. Kanye didn't move. 12% North African, concentrated in Morocco. She turned the page slowly, deliberately, as if lifting a veil. 5% European, traced to Scandinavian markers. A few heads tilted in confusion. Others furrowed their brows trying to process what came next. 4% Central Asian ancestry. Minimal distribution. Jasmine drew a steady breath. Her next words arrived like a stone dropped into a still lake. There is zero genetic correlation to Levantine Jewish ancestry. No evidence of Hebrew lineage. None. The words were not delivered with venom. They were not weaponized. They were simply placed, like truth left on a table, unadorned, unshakable, and then nothing. Not even a cough. The room froze under the weight of that final sentence. The same room that had echoed minutes ago with Kanye's fire and flare now held its collective breath. Phones stopped tapping, pens stopped scribbling. Even the journalists in the press box, poised like vultures at the edge of scandal, seemed unsure what to do next. Kanye sat still. His face was half shrouded in shadow from the courtroom lights above, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. His knuckles had gone white around the microphone, still clenched in his right hand. The same hand that had once waved Grammys, now trembling almost imperceptibly, though he tried to mask it by pressing it harder against the handle. He didn't blink, didn't shift, but something inside him had cracked. Not loud, not obvious, but undeniable to anyone looking closely. His eyes never left the table. Whether out of defiance or disbelief, no one could be sure. But his silence, the same man who moments ago spoke of prophecy and bloodlines, now spoke volumes. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the report, her posture dignified, calm, unshaken. If there was emotion in her chest, she buried it deep. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about being right. It was about accountability. Not for ego, but for fact. Not for applause, but for clarity. The murmurs started slowly. A chair creaked. Someone shifted their weight. Eyes darted from Kanye to Jasmine and back again, searching for meaning in the aftermath. In the back row, a woman covered her mouth. A staffer lowered his iPad slowly, forgetting to stop the recording. It felt like the end of something ancient. Not a battle, but a belief. The stillness lasted another 10 seconds, but it felt like hours. And in that time, everything changed. And just when the silence was beginning to solidify, thick, suffocating, almost holy in its stillness, Kanye's chair screeched backward like a blade against steel. The sudden movement startled even the most stoic staffers. He rose to his feet, not as an icon, not as a musician, not even as a man under scrutiny, but as a wounded zealot staring down the ruins of his own mythology. His hands slammed the table. "No!" he thundered, his voice hoarse with disbelief and pride. This cannot be real." The report still lay open before him, each line of genetic percentages like a nail hammered into the altar he had built for himself. He pointed to it as if it were a personal insult carved into parchment. "You want me to bow to a piece of paper? You think this invalidates me?" His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from an overwhelming mixture of rage, confusion, and the creeping horror of exposure. "I don't need DNA to validate the fire that burns in my chest." He turned toward Jasmine, not with hatred, but with something stranger, Betrayal. You don't get it, do you? You've built your house on laws. I built mine on revelation. That's why I see what you can't. His breath was shallow now, shoulders rising and falling, his body trembling from the sheer effort of containing everything unraveling inside him. Blood doesn't say everything. It doesn't carry prophecy. My music, my voice, my vision, those weren't born in a lab. He began to pace, his long coat flaring with every step, the crucifix around his neck swinging like a pendulum out of rhythm. You think I'm a fraud? He asked no one in particular, or maybe everyone. Then you've never understood what it means to be chosen, marked, not by genes, but by burden. He faced the audience now, eyes scanning the room, looking for something to anchor to. But there was only silence. Dead, unblinking, suffocating silence. And then, quieter now, with a voice edged in steel and sorrow, he declared, I know who I am, even if the world forgets, even if the data disagrees. The silence in the room now felt like pressure, thick, almost physical. Kanye's last words still echoed off the walls. I know who I am. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't match fire with fire. Instead, she let the silence settle, let the weight of truth fill the cracks where ego had just been. She looked at him, not with vengeance, not even judgment, but with a level gaze that said, you asked for the truth. This is it. Her voice, when it came, was even, clear, almost too calm for how deeply it would cut. I'm not here to take your faith from you, yeah. The use of his chosen name wasn't mocking. It was respectful, deliberate. Faith is sacred, personal. I'd never reach into a man's soul and try to take that. She paused just long enough for the words to breathe. Then she took a step closer, not to intimidate, but to close the space between spectacle and accountability. But belief, when it's turned into a weapon to rewrite history, to sell records, to justify distortion, becomes something else entirely. That's not faith. That's branding. That's manipulation. The tension in the room sharpened like a blade being drawn. You didn't just believe you were a descendant of prophets. You sold that belief. You printed it on album covers. You signed contracts that commodified it. You used it to dismiss the real pain, the real struggle of people trying to hold on to what little truth they have left. Her voice never rose, but it carried further now, as if it had found its own gravity. She reached into her folder and pulled out one contract, black ink, legal seals, and his signature in bold at the bottom. This clause, she said, holding it up, wasn't about faith. It was about controlling narrative. It explicitly authorizes adjustments to genetic data presented to the public, if those results didn't align with the story being sold. A low murmur stirred among the viewers, but Jasmine kept going, not swayed by the noise. You signed that, she said quietly. You approved the language. You made truth optional. Then she stepped back, letting the paper speak as loudly as her words. No one is banning your belief, but when belief gets repackaged into a product that contradicts verified evidence, affects public understanding, and manipulates culture, it becomes propaganda. She let the word hang in the air like smoke from a fire someone pretended wasn't burning. And then, in a voice that was both fierce and devastatingly calm, she delivered the line that would echo far beyond that room. Faith, she said, looking directly into his eyes, doesn't need a lie to survive. And while the room remained breathless in the aftermath of Jasmine's final words, the outside world was already catching fire, not with chaos, but with clarity. The moment the live stream ended, the digital world exploded. Within seconds, the clip of Jasmine locking eyes with Kanye and saying, "Faith doesn't need a lie to survive," hit every major platform. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, even encrypted forums that usually ignored politics altogether. It wasn't just trending, it was volcanic. The hashtags started as sparks and became wildfires. DNA and faith, truth hurts, but heals, and the most brutal of all, Crockett crushes them. Within 10 minutes, Jasmine's name had overtaken the Super Bowl, a tech IPO, and a celebrity scandal. Millions weren't just watching, they were reacting like they'd been waiting for this reckoning for years. In Brooklyn, a group of young activists projected the quote onto the side of a building using a modified drone-like grid. In Los Angeles, a protest scheduled for labor rights quickly shifted tone, with signs hastily rewritten in Sharpie. Truth myth, faith can't be bought, and we stand with Crockett. Even high school classrooms across the country halted their lessons mid-period, teachers pausing to discuss the deeper implications of identity, culture, and accountability. This wasn't a viral moment. This was a cultural earthquake. Underneath a post by CNN summarizing the DNA findings, the comment section read like a battlefield. Some defended Kanye, calling the test a trap. Others fired back with receipts, videos, old interviews, every moment where Ye had positioned himself as the chosen one without proof, now dissected and laid bare. But above all, one phrase kept resurfacing like a war drum. We're done mistaking charisma for truth. Across Jewish communities in New York, Tel Aviv, and London, major organizations released coordinated statements. One in particular struck with surgical precision. The American Jewish Ethical Alliance wrote, "This is not a moment of humiliation. This is a moment of closure. We've seen our heritage repurposed, romanticized, and rebranded for commercial benefit. Today, with humility and clarity, we say, the era of sacred distortion ends now." Their final line trended on its own. No more borrowed bloodlines. Media outlets scrambled to respond. MSNBC ran an emergency panel. Fox News tried to spin the moment as a political takedown, but even their own anchors struggled to ignore the irrefutable evidence. The DNA report, verified by 3 independent, government-sealed labs, was posted in full on the Department of Public Records official site. There was no hiding from it. No lawyer, no crisis manager, no studio edit could soften it. It was truth, raw and unfiltered, moving at the speed of light. Jasmine, meanwhile, hadn't posted a word. Not a single tweet, not a press release, not even a photo. And that silence made the noise louder. People began stitching together video clips of her confrontation with Kanye, pairing them with gospel music, orchestral tension scores, even lo-fi hip-hop beats. One version, edited like a movie trailer, racked up over 12 million views in under an hour. The caption read simply, "When facts speak, the ego bleeds." In Chicago, a local news station interviewed a 76-year-old black pastor who held up his Bible and said, "She didn't attack belief. She defended it from being hijacked." His words echoed across social feeds with thousands commenting, "That's the whole point." College professors began updating syllabi. Journalists retracted op-eds they'd once written in praise of Kanye's spiritual awakening. And for the first time in years, the narrative had shifted, not through outrage, but through evidence. Some communities in the music industry didn't know how to respond. Longtime collaborators of Ye went dark, unsure whether to defend, denounce, or disappear. Record labels quietly pulled marketing campaigns tied to his latest Hebrew origin merch line. One insider leaked a memo stating, "All Hebrew branding on future products is suspended until further legal review." It wasn't cancel culture, it was cultural self-correction. Slow, awkward, but inevitable. Meanwhile, social media began turning its lens on something far deeper, the systems that enabled this myth in the first place. Who greenlit the documentaries? Who funded the stage shows with religious iconography? Who ignored the warnings when scholars called out his claims as pseudo-history years ago? Hashtag number industry built. The myth began climbing, pulling producers, editors, and managers into the scrutiny. The machine behind the message was now on trial, and Jasmine hadn't said a word since the hearing. By sundown, a digital petition had gained over 400,000 signatures, demanding music platforms flag content that promoted racial or ethnic misinformation. One university offered Jasmine an honorary doctorate in cultural ethics. Another invited her to headline a global conference on faith and identity. Her inbox, according to a leaked screenshot, had over 3,000 requests in 2 hours, from civil rights groups, universities, artists, even clergymen. But for every action, there was pushback. Some of Kanye's most devout followers clung tighter. A live stream titled "Ye Was Framed, The Truth Behind the Trap" pulled 1.2 million views, arguing that the DNA tests were forged. A popular influencer claimed, "Science is a tool of empire. What matters is spirit, not blood. Yet even within those circles, fractures formed. Devotees asked hard questions. If Ye's claim was real, why hide data? Why sign clauses? Why adjust results? The myth had been wounded, not by mockery, but by the one thing it couldn't absorb: verified, unshakable truth. And in the eye of the storm, Jasmine remained silent. No interviews, no rebuttals, no victory lap. That silence only amplified her credibility. She didn't fight with noise. She fought with documents, dates, and discipline. She didn't humiliate him. He did that to himself by building a podium out of paper and pretending it was stone. At 11:42 p.m., a user posted a simple image on X, formerly Twitter. A photo of Jasmine's still face during the hearing, with these words in white block font: "The truth doesn't scream, it stands." By midnight, it had been shared over 10 million times. But just when the digital world thought it had processed the shock, the media reignited the fire with a comparison too sharp to ignore. A name whispered like a warning: Rachel Dolezal. It started subtly, buried halfway down an article in The Atlantic. A line noting that Kanye West's DNA scandal bore unmistakable echoes of Dolezal's deception. But by the time the morning cycle hit cable news, it was no longer a footnote. It was the headline. CNN, BBC, The New York Times, even Al Jazeera began rerunning archival footage of Rachel Dolezal, once president of an NAACP chapter, later exposed for pretending to be black despite being born to white parents. The montage was swift and brutal. Spliced shots of Dolezal defending her lived blackness, played side by side with Kanye standing in court, denying his test results. This wasn't just cultural critique, it was trial by history, and the jury had long memories. Social media pounced. Viral threads dissected the parallels in excruciating detail. One post read, "Rachel dyed her skin. Kanye dyed the story." Another simply said, "From braids to bloodlines, why does identity always get twisted when there's money to be made?" Underneath it all, the current was clear. People weren't just angry about deception. They were exhausted by the repetition. Once again, a powerful figure had used the aesthetic of heritage to elevate themselves, only to be exposed by cold, scientific fact. Daytime talk shows became battlegrounds. On The View, a guest panelist raised her voice. "When Dolezal did it, we were told it was delusion. When Ye does it, people say it's branding." Why the double standard? The audience erupted. Meanwhile, Trevor Noah returned from hiatus with a cold open that said it all. A deep fake of Kanye reciting Dolezal's infamous quote, "I identify as black." The laugh track didn't even finish before cutting to the real clip of Jasmine reading the DNA results aloud. The comparison cut especially deep because it forced an uncomfortable truth into the spotlight. Some lies, when told by the powerful, are not called lies. They're called marketing. For years, Kanye had wrapped himself in Jewish iconography, declaring himself a vessel of ancient bloodlines. He wasn't selling faith, he was selling proximity to myth. Now, as the illusion crumbled, the question wasn't just, did he lie? It was, how many people helped him lie because it sold sneakers, albums, and headlines? Late-night news shows ran montages under chilling soundtracks. Headlines flashed across the screen. Manufactured Messiah? Faith or fabrication? The Rachel Dolezal of hip-hop? Clips of Dolezal insisting her identity was not about biology now echoed eerily against Kanye's own protest. "I don't need DNA to prove my soul." They had never met, but now by public decree they were bound together as cautionary tales of borrowed suffering. But the deepest impact wasn't on Kanye, it was on Jasmine. She became the new lightning rod. Accusations began pouring in from every direction. Pundits on the far right called her a race-baiting destroyer of black icons. Fringe voices on the far left asked, why expose him at all? Why not protect one of our own? She was caught in a paradox, praised for telling the truth, punished for making it public. And yet in every interview request she declined, in every headline she ignored, Jasmine seemed to be saying the same thing. The truth doesn't need my permission to exist. Behind the scenes, journalists and academics began reevaluating their own complicity. A Columbia University cultural historian released a thread titled Timeline of Silence, tracking every major outlet that had promoted Kanye's identity claims without fact-checking them. The list was long. It included best-selling magazines, music documentaries, and even museum partnerships. Each had given legitimacy to the myth because it was profitable. Now they were scrambling to rewrite history, except Jasmine had already done it in real time, with receipts. Documentaries were pitched within days. Netflix reportedly greenlit a two-part series titled False Prophets: The Invention of Identity, with episode 1 focused on Rachel Dolezal and episode 2 on Kanye West. Even streaming services wanted in on the reckoning. Producers whispered about which actors could play Jasmine, though she hadn't given a single nod to being involved. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. The spotlight had turned and found her because her evidence was the one thing that hadn't flinched under scrutiny. And yet, for many Black Americans watching this unfold, the moment struck a painful chord. They remembered how Rachel Dolezal had appropriated pain, how she'd worn trauma like a costume, borrowed struggle like fashion. Now, watching Kanye fall into the same pattern, weaponizing ancient suffering for modern glory, felt like a betrayal twice over. One tweet put it best: when Rachel did it, we laughed. When Ye did it, we sang along. Both times we paid the price. Think pieces exploded across cultural magazines. The Root, Slate, Vibe, Tablet magazine, all asking some version of the same question. What does it cost to people when identity is open source? They didn't just scrutinize Ye. They examined America's hunger for icons, its thirst for redemption arcs, and its blind spot when those arcs are built on fiction. It wasn't just Kanye on trial anymore. It was the culture that let him do it unchecked. And through it all, Jasmine remained calm. In the few clips caught of her leaving the hearing, she looked neither triumphant nor regretful, just focused. When asked by a reporter if she had meant to bring Kanye down, she paused, then simply said, "I didn't bring anyone down. I just refused to lift a lie." The clip went viral instantly, but it was the way she said it, without anger, without gloating, that cemented her as something more than a whistleblower. She was the reckoning personified. By week's end, schools had added new case studies to sociology courses. Public libraries hosted panels on identity ethics. And on the cover of Time magazine, Jasmine's face appeared under 3 words: the cost of pretending. Not a crown, not a sword, just a mirror. And this time, the world was forced to look. The silence that followed Jasmine's final statement was not merely a pause, it was a reckoning. The weight of the truth had settled across the nation like smoke after an explosion, and the man once revered as a cultural prophet had vanished. No more late-night rants, no cryptic tweets, no paparazzi glimpses outside Calabasas. For 30 straight days, Kanye West, disappeared. And in an age where absence screams louder than presence, the void left behind was deafening. Speculations filled the vacuum like wildfire, but none were confirmed. Those who once defended him fell quiet. Even his inner circle offered no updates, no PR cover, no deflection. What had once been noise was now replaced by a single breathless question: would he return at all? Then one cold Friday morning, an envelope arrived. No logo, no fanfare. Just a hand-delivered sheet of paper, creased, slightly smudged, and written in unmistakable ink. It wasn't addressed to a journalist or an influencer or even a fan base. It was posted online by an anonymous user who simply wrote, he wanted this to speak for itself, and speak it did. In his own hand, uneven and raw, Kanye had written, I used to think I was a fallen angel, but maybe I'm just a man trying to climb toward the truth. 9 lines of ink, one punch to the soul. The letter didn't explain his silence. It didn't defend his past. There was no spin, no signature slogan, no attempt to regain control. Instead, it read like something scraped from the deepest part of a wounded man. He spoke of walls he had built from pride, of truths he had dressed in noise, and of faith that he had confused with ego. He wrote slowly, each word a confession, each sentence a step down from the pedestal he had once built for himself. "I mistook volume for vision," one line read. "I thought truth was whatever I could say loudest." It was not a rebranding, it was a surrender. In the margins, scrawled like afterthoughts, were fragments that cut sharper than the letter itself. "I was more afraid of being ordinary than being wrong." And below it, circled twice, "But fear doesn't free anyone." There was no call for redemption, no plea for forgiveness. It was the rarest kind of public moment, one not crafted for applause, but offered in vulnerability. The man who once draped himself in Messiah imagery now stripped himself bare. In doing so, he did what no press conference ever could. He let the silence speak, and then he filled it with truth. For Jasmine, the letter was never about vindication. She never responded publicly, but those closest to her noticed something different when she read it. Something in the way she lingered on the sentence about truth and climbing, because beneath the legal arguments, beneath the confrontation, her battle had always been for clarity, not destruction. And now, after everything, even the man who had stood defiantly in front of the world was admitting, the truth had caught up. Kanye's return wasn't a spectacle. There was no entourage, no music drop, no carefully lit Instagram post. Just the letter, and then a photo, days later, of him walking alone through a park in Wyoming. Hoodie up, head down, no jewelry, no Yeezys. And in his hand, barely visible, was a worn notebook. The image felt almost biblical. The prophet without a pulpit, the artist without an audience, the man without armor. But something else was shifting too. In quiet corners of the internet, not the loud ones, people began sharing the letter, not to mock, but to reflect. Conversations moved from shame to introspection. Former fans who once felt betrayed now found themselves oddly moved, not by the man he had been, but by the man he was trying to become. And across communities that had once stood on opposite sides of the argument, a strange and fragile bridge was beginning to form. Not reconciliation, not yet, but recognition of pain, of loss, of the sheer cost of belief when it's placed in broken vessels. Kanye's next move was not an album. It was not a brand. It was not even a statement. It was a single act. He enrolled under a pseudonym in a theology course at a small university in rural California. The professors didn't announce it. The classmates were sworn to secrecy. But one student, in a journal entry later published anonymously, described the moment he walked in. He didn't speak for the first week. He just listened. And when he finally raised his hand, he didn't quote scripture. He asked a question. How do you unlearn what ego taught you to believe was holy? That question, more than any lyric he ever wrote, more than any fashion line, more than any outburst, became the heartbeat of his quiet journey forward. And while the world may never cheer for a quiet man, they remember him differently. Not as the icon who never faltered, but as the human who finally did, and chose not to run from the fall. And while Ye's journey inward unfolded in solitude, Jasmine's path surged outward, with clarity sharpened by fire. The Capitol lights never dimmed for long. Within days of the fallout, Jasmine Crockett returned to the place where everything had begun, not for applause, but for unfinished business. The committee chambers that once echoed with judgment were now arenas of reform. Bills that had stalled were suddenly gaining momentum. Conversations once buried in politics were dragged into daylight. But behind the scenes, she moved with the same precision that had dismantled a cultural icon on live television. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was rewriting systems, quietly, methodically, relentlessly. The moment came during a CNN evening segment, a live sit-down hosted in front of a studio audience, framed by the soft hum of stage lights and the ever-rolling camera. The anchor leaned forward, eyes locked on her with the tension of someone trying to poke a sleeping lion. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "if you could describe Kanye West in one sentence, after everything, what would you say he is?" There was no hesitation, no glance at notes, no performance. Jasmine turned her gaze toward the host, her voice firm but grounded. "A man searching for his origin," she said, and then, after a beat, "I only helped him look with a better instrument, truth." There was no applause, just a pause, a silence more powerful than claps could ever be. The kind of pause when the weight of meaning settles into the bones of everyone listening. The kind of pause that reminds a nation it just witnessed a shift. She didn't speak with arrogance. There was no gloating in her voice, no scent of revenge. It was the tone of someone who had walked through storms not to punish, but to clarify. And in that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman, she was the mirror that power often avoids. Clear, steady, unflinching. Outside the studio, reactions exploded. Some called it cold. Others called it necessary. But none could deny the authority in her calm. Because while Kanye had stumbled publicly toward a personal reckoning, Jasmine had remained steady at the helm of public truth. And that truth, sharpened by her work, was already shifting things on the Hill. Behind closed doors, lobbyists grew quieter. Representatives who once smirked when she entered hearings now listened longer. She had done what few could. She had proven that truth, when delivered with precision, could shake both culture and Congress. Back in her office, Jasmine kept a single item framed on her wall. Not a headline, not a photo, but a handwritten note from a girl in Detroit. It read, "You didn't yell, you didn't cry, but you made the world stop, and I want to be just like you." Jasmine had read it 100 times, not because she needed validation, but because it reminded her what was at stake. Not celebrity, not vengeance, but clarity for a generation raised in noise. The CNN clips circulated within hours. Hashtags erupted again, but this time, they weren't about Ye. They were about her. Crockett method, truth with grace, quiet power. For once, it wasn't about who had fallen. It was about who had stood up and how. She walked out of that interview the same way she had entered the Capitol that morning, head high, back straight, alone. There were no entourages, no flashbulbs, just Jasmine and the weight of what it means to speak truth without needing to win. And the nation? It watched, not for spectacle, but for what came next. But long after the applause faded, long after the hashtags cooled and the headlines moved on, a quieter truth remained, one not about Kanye or Jasmine, but about all of us. We live in an age that confuses noise with meaning, where platforms are mistaken for pulpits and charisma is too often confused for character. Kanye's fall was not a spectacle, it was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when belief is no longer grounded in reality, but in mythology. He didn't fall because of his ancestry, he fell because he built an empire on a truth no one had dared to test, until Jasmine did, not out of hatred, not out of ego. But because some lies grow so large, they must be pierced before they become scripture. And in that piercing, we all bled a little. Because who among us hasn't clung to a comforting illusion? Who hasn't believed what we wanted to be true instead of what was true? His pain wasn't foreign. It was familiar. It was the ache of realizing that your identity can't be manufactured and your worth can't be inherited. It must be earned through clarity, humility, and the courage to face yourself in the rawest light. Jasmine never mocked his journey. She illuminated it. And in doing so, she taught a nation something we keep forgetting, that truth is not the enemy of faith. Truth is its foundation. You cannot build belief on denial. You cannot defend your soul with a forged script. You cannot ask the world to trust you if you are unwilling to confront yourself. The lesson wasn't just for Kanye. It was for the millions watching who saw a man stripped of illusion and a woman who didn't flinch. The courage wasn't in the confrontation. It was in the restraint. Jasmine could have humiliated him. She didn't. She could have shouted. She whispered. Because real strength doesn't need volume. It needs vision. And in a time of loud lies, quiet truth is the sharpest blade. But the deeper message, the one that cut across politics, fame, and legacy, was this: identity is sacred. And when you borrow a story that is not yours, you risk silencing those who truly lived it. For centuries, the Jewish people have fought to preserve their lineage, their language, their land. And when someone with power attempts to co-opt that suffering for spectacle, it does more than mislead. It desecrates. Jasmine stood not just as a congresswoman, not just as a black woman, but as a protector of that sacred line between honoring heritage and hijacking it. She drew that line without theatrics, without vengeance, just with facts and the unshakable conviction that no one, no matter how famous, is above accountability. And yeah, for all his bravado, heard her. Maybe not at first, maybe not even in public, but when he disappeared, when the silence swallowed him for 30 days, something shifted, not just in him, but in us. Because we saw what happens when a man stops shouting and starts listening, when ego collapses and soul begins to speak, when the story isn't about proving who you are, but discovering it for real without distortion. His handwritten letter wasn't an apology. It was something braver. It was an admission that sometimes truth breaks you before it builds you, that sometimes the fall is the only way forward. I thought I was a fallen angel, he wrote, but maybe I'm just a man trying to climb toward truth. It wasn't poetry, it was surrender. And in that surrender, there was beauty. This is the kind of reckoning we all need. In an era built on filters, edits, and digital personas, Jasmine and Ye reminded us that real identity can't be downloaded, branded, or bought. It must be lived, earned, tested. And when challenged, it must not collapse into defensiveness, but rise into reflection. That's the lesson. Truth does not destroy us. It exposes what was never real to begin with. And in doing so, it gives us the chance to begin again, this time grounded. For Kanye, that meant losing a version of himself that never truly existed. For Jasmine, it meant risking backlash for standing firm. For the rest of us, it meant realizing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to believe, but to question, to pause, to ask, is what I claim about myself rooted in experience or just desire? There is no shame in seeking, only in pretending. His journey wasn't shameful, it was human. The tragedy would have been if no one had ever dared to tell him the truth. But someone did. And in that moment, we all saw what justice looks like. Not as punishment, but as clarity. Because justice isn't always a gavel or a verdict. Sometimes it's a mirror held steady in the face of power. And sometimes the bravest act isn't confronting another. It's confronting the lie we tell ourselves. But reflection alone is not enough. The truth revealed on that stage, by Jasmine, through Kanye for all of us, wasn't meant to end in silence. It was meant to stir something deeper, the need to act, to demand more, to become the generation that refuses to let illusion pass as identity or silence passes peace. This is not just about one celebrity, one courtroom, or one confrontation. It's about what we allow to be sold to us as truth. It's about what we accept in our politics, in our media, in our schools, in our churches. How many falsehoods still stand because no one has dared to test them? How many lies still live simply because they wear a familiar name or speak with a confident voice? We must not wait for another Jasmine to carry the weight of truth alone. We must be willing to step forward, uncomfortable, uncertain, but unwavering. Speak up when facts are twisted. Push back when power rewrites history. Raise your hand when everyone else lowers their gaze. Justice is not an event, it's a habit. And truth is not just something we demand from others, it's something we owe ourselves. If you've ever watched injustice unfold and said nothing, this is your chance to begin again. If you've ever felt too small to matter, remember, Jasmine was once just a law student with nothing but a backpack and a reason. Now she's changed the shape of a national conversation because she chose clarity over comfort, courage over applause. You too have that power. Whether in your community, your classroom, your family, or your feed, use it. Ask the hard questions, read the fine print, challenge the narrative. And when you see someone standing for truth, stand with them. Loudly, publicly, unapologetically. Because if this story taught us anything, it's that the loudest person in the room isn't always the most honest. And sometimes the quietest truth, spoken with resolve, can dismantle an empire built on noise. Now is the moment to choose who we want to be. Will we be the crowd that cheers at the fall of a lie, or the movement that ensures the next lie never rises? Will we consume drama, or confront reality? Will we scroll past injustice or stop and say, not here, not again? The answer begins not with fame or fortune, but with a single voice, yours. And so I ask you now, not as a writer, not as a witness, but as someone who believes in the power of what comes next. Don't just be inspired, be involved, because truth once seen cannot be unseen, and justice, once awakened, will not sleep again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.